Welcome back, everyone, to the third session in this course on the progress and poverty of the single tax political activities, going back as far as Henry George and the first single tax conferences. And we're now making our way up into the 1920s in this story. And if you remember from last week, the single tax party had put candidates up for office in 1920 and was planning to do so again in 1924. And through some internal discussion, the top people in the movement decided that they might have better luck if they changed the name of the party to the Commonwealth Land Party. And that's what they did. And the candidates they ran for president and vice president were William J. Wallace of New Jersey and John C. Lincoln ran for vice president. And John C. Lincoln was a businessman from Ohio. And we'll talk a little bit more about him. Before I go on too far, I'm going to ask for volunteer readers. So if anyone on is willing to do that, just let me know when we get to a quotation that's up on the screen, and I'd love to have you handle that responsibility, and maybe several of you like we did last week. Well, Wallace was a business executive. He was president of the Eck Dynamo and Motor Company, and he was born in 1860. He was a graduate of the College of the City of New York. And since 1896, he headed his own company. And then in 1919, he was on the single tax party's ticket as a candidate for the United States Senator from New York. And unfortunately did not win in that election. John C. Lincoln, the party's nominee for vice president, was also a business executive, president of the Lincoln Motor Works of Cleveland, Ohio. And this is a company that is still very much in existence. Their claim to fame early on, when John Lincoln was the executive, was the development of arc welding equipment, and a number of unique characteristics of his company made it grow. One was his company was the first company in the United States to offer employees profit sharing. And so different from many other companies that have top-down management, John Lincoln took advice from his employees on how to improve efficiency, how to improve product. And he rewarded his employees for their contributions in a meaningful way. And so he had very loyal employees. And for decades, going through different economic cycles, they never had a layoff at the Lincoln Electric Company. But in 1924, he explained to readers of Land and Freedom why he chose to run for the vice presidential position in the United States. He said this: volunteer.
Yeah, volunteer. This is Marty.
Marty, I can always count on you to start the ball rolling, and I appreciate that.
Okay. The Commonwealth Land Party proposes to reassert the right of all of us to what the Creator has provided for all of us.
Yeah. Fundamental. What the Creator has provided for all of us, which is nature. And so, he is demonstrating, he's declaring himself very much consistent with Henry George's principles, that the earth is the birthright for all persons equally. So how do we make that happen? That's been the challenge. That's the challenge that John C. Lincoln accepted for himself, and certainly was the same for William Wallace. Crucial for Lincoln, the Commonwealth Land Party's platform was true to single tax principles. And here are some excerpts from the platform, Marty, if you would care to read these.
Oh, sure. All evils arising out of our unjust economic conditions, such as business depressions, hard times, unemployment, poverty, and the fear of poverty, bad housing conditions, and the crime, vice, and disease due to these conditions are the result of the private ownership of the earth and the appropriation of its products by the few.
1924, think about it. How close to those conditions still what we're experiencing today? And the platform went on.
Okay, war and strife, now and always due to economic maladjustment, would disappear with the elimination of private ownership of land, which has ever been the basis and the cause of all the world's economic troubles.
Remember that Henry George called for land nationalization. And when it became clear that politically that was going to be impossible to achieve, his supporters, those who followed, gradually began to embrace the single tax idea, that hopefully they could get close enough to land nationalization through the use of tax policy. And in the platform, here's the last piece that I have quoted.
I guess I'll wrap this up.
Thank you.
No structure built in violation of natural law can stand. Civilization built in such violation must fall. Other civilizations have gone down. The foundations of the civilization are crumbling. If civilization is to live, private ownership of land must go. If private ownership of land continues, this civilization is doomed.
Your reactions. We've made it through to 2023. This was 1924. I don't know exactly what time horizon John C. Lincoln thought this might come true, but what do you think? Are we now closer than ever before? Are you feeling optimistic, pessimistic about the future? Does it seem as though, with what's going on in the world, in our society, that civilization is coming close to this consequence of being doomed? Anybody care to express your opinions on this, your thoughts?
Watching the news, with the number of shootings, the number of people who chose to either die by suicide or die by having the police kill them, it seems to be going up. And of course, each one of those is isolated in some way or other, but there's a
do you think
desperation out there.
Is that symptomatic of a loss of sort of community? Do you think, a sense that we're in this together? Are people feeling isolated and desperate in that isolation? Do you think that's part of it?
I think that's part of it. I think a lot of it's economic, that they don't feel that they can support themselves with the skills they've got, and people who had perhaps learning difficulties dropped all hope.
Yeah, that's probably a big part of it. People losing hope, and the mental problems that comes when you lost hope. Maybe it's the start of, or the outcome of a long period of time when you've had a difficulty in life. Marty, you were next on with your hand up.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with the loss of community. I've done a little research, and I'm finishing up a paper for the American Journal of Economic Sociology, and it has to do exactly on that, going back to 10,000 BC and the cycle of community development, whether it's a temple or a monument or something, and then eventually the private interests get involved, and then people get in debt. So the cycle continues throughout history, and I think it was Solon that said, we can't have masses in debt too much, or else they'll revolt. And I think that's the key to what you're talking about, is that the powers that have a lot of influence have figured out how to maintain something less than the threshold. So whether it's drugs, sex, alcohol, or rock and roll, or whatever it takes, they'll figure out some way.
Well, the paper that you're writing for the American Journal, is it going to have an optimistic solution offered in the end?
Well, the optimistic solution is that we take the message to heart, and if the conditions suggest that we should assert our rights, you could interpret that to be, politically divisive, in the sense that reclaiming our ownership. But I think that's what history teaches us, is that we need that community.
Well, I look forward to reading it when it comes out.
Yeah.
So, Michael, how are you this evening, and what's on your mind?
Oh yes, I've been looking at this question, and the phrase I want to introduce to you, or you probably know it already, is the property state.
Mm-hmm.
Property state, and it's being spoken about by a number of people here in London, etc. Gavin Kerr wrote a book about it, etc. And he's the current chair of the Henry George Foundation here. But in fact, it's in that last sentence. If private ownership of land continues, this civilization is doomed. So that would imply or suggest that if the state owns the land, etc., or the property, and can introduce a rent for the use of that land, then the situation is done. The rewards that would normally go to private ownership, because of that private ownership, return to the state. So it's a simple switch, really.
Well, it seems to be simple for those of us who've studied Henry George, but for many others in our societies, the idea of the state taking ownership of these natural assets creates a good deal of fear, and a good deal of fear of the state. So it's
that's disappointing, isn't it, really? Because
well, is it because our politicians deserve no more trust than we can, we don't give them any more rope to hang themselves, or are our laws not being adequately enforced? There's all of that. Are the laws fair? And if the laws are just, are they being justly enforced? Are people getting away with violating the laws because of their political influence or their economic status in the world? I mean, these are the things we deal with every day.
You may have picked up our news item. It's quite prominent in this country. We had a coronation this last days. It was very pretty to watch. But I'm not a monarchist, and so I have issues with monarchy. But it's quite clear, and it's quite on the record, that the crown, the king, or the Prince of Wales, who's the next in line, owns vast acres of land, and derives a benefit from that. So they're the biggest landowners in the country, but that, although they might be conceived as not private, it very much is private, and that fortune is built up. It's an issue that is being raised in the newspapers now.
Well, as our colleague Fred Harrison would say, the problem goes back to Magna Carta, and
it goes back before that.
Yeah. Wayne, how are you this evening?
Okay, fine. I want to continue on with with what I'll deal with what I was originally going to say later, but I do want to reply to Michael Leroy. This is what bothers me about at least one person in the Georgist movement, who is, of all things, trying to get wrote an open letter to King Charles III, suggesting that he adopt Georgism. Elena Hartsock has done this, and I really look at that as a fool's errand.
Quite right.
Well, I have a little bit of history understanding of how that letter was generated, and it wasn't Alana's idea to write this letter, this open letter to the king. It was the idea of some other activists that she has developed a working relationship with. Yeah. And so they think it might be just a good way to bring attention to the issues, and eventually no one expects the king to respond with anything substantive, but yes. But we'll see what happens. You had something else you wanted to add?
Hey, I'm not going to hold my breath for the.
Okay. No, I don't think anyone's holding their breath.
Yeah. The other thing is this was realized that the statement by John C. Lincoln was written shortly after the First World War, but before the Great Depression and before World War II and before the Cold War. I guess there's as one wag once said, there's a lot of ruin in the country, and I guess similarly there's a lot of ruin in the world. So you got to go a long ways to really destroy civilization, considering what's happened. It came close to it in 2 world wars, but it didn't quite do it.
Yeah, I don't. He may have written more extensively on the issue of how long it might take for civilization to falter. But certainly, as Wynn's comments, raise, and we all read the newspapers, listen to the media, participate in social media, there are many reasons for us to be deeply concerned about where we are and where we're headed.
Oh, without a doubt. But the question is, you got to go a long ways to really destroy civilization.
Let us hope it's a long ways off and that we have time to pull back from the precipice. Bruce, how are you?
I'm fine. I just wanted to mention there's a little family thing here, is that in 1930, my father was expelled from the University of Pittsburgh. And for the next 10 years, he worked for the Socialist Party and in Chicago.
And was his reason for being expelled because he was politically active in the wrong way?
Yeah, basically that was the reason he was expelled, and so it's a little interesting because, like I said, my family thing is it's the Socialist Party, Norman Thomas, and all of that. And I guess in 1940, my father quit all that and he went to work for the labor movement. So so that's my connection to this.
Yeah, well, the issue of we could get into a little bit of a discussion about the alliance between organized labor and the single taxers, and there was a relationship, and certainly Lincoln as an executive, Wallace as executives. The question would be, did the labor unions look at them as potentially reputable leaders? Could they trust them if they were elected? And I think Lincoln demonstrated by his practices of running his business and by the loyalty that he gendered with his employees, that labor was probably fairly warm to him. But I haven't looked at that in any serious way, so I don't know the answer to that. But it's another part of this story that needs to be researched even more. To what extent they certainly tried to cultivate a relationship with labor, but here again, this is a third party, and in the United States, just as the socialists had a difficult time, libertarians have had a difficult time, the Green Party's had a difficult time, the Commonwealth Land Party certainly had a difficult time getting people to break from the two mainstream parties for whatever reasons and convince them that they should vote for a third party without the idea that we often hear today. You vote for a third party, you're basically throwing your vote away. So it's a very challenging goal that they have, trying to win public support. So let me go on from there, and thanks everyone for your comments. They're much appreciated. So the party in New York issued a one-page document that made the party's case for voter support. And what they urged New Yorkers to consider was whether their interests were actually being served by those who already held office. So it gets to this, whole question of how do we win voters away from voting for the Democrats or the Republicans as they're apt to do. And here's what this one pager said. Someone else volunteered to read?
I can read.
Yanis, thank you.
Yes. Both of the major political parties in the United States are working in a circle, and their efforts are futile as far as the betterment of the condition of labor and the general betterment of the less fortunate members of society is concerned.
Continue.
If either of these parties secures any increase in the wages of labor, this includes salaries and all returns for labor, mental and physical, then the cost of living rises at the same time, so that the raise in wages amounts to nothing, for it is simply a case of equals being added to equals.
And we know that, this is 1924, and it's certainly been consistent over the decades, all the way up until today. So, all of the people that are now on strike or attempting to negotiate for higher wages, the cost of living, most particularly housing, but medical care, food, everything will likely go up, and they'll end up, if they're lucky, basically, matching the increase in cost of living, but not doing any better. So just think about it from the standpoint of appealing to people, and everyone thinks, okay, this is the way it is, but what can we do about it? And the Commonwealth Land Party is offering some solutions, but will people agree? They might agree that the solutions make sense, but they're still not going to necessarily be willing to vote for candidates in a third party because they don't see that will benefit them. And if they're in New York, of course, Tammany Hall is still in control. And so, people were going to the polls very much in the way they went to the polls, in previous, decades. And that is, if you make sure you vote the right way, then your committeeman, your ward leader, et cetera, will maybe make sure that you get a job opportunity when that comes up, or that your street gets services when services are needed. So this is a very moral kind of challenge that the Commonwealth Land Party is making, and the question is whether or not appealing to people's ethics and morality will win votes. And unfortunately, we know the outcome. Well, a reporter from the Newark Star Eagle interviewed Wallace early in 1924, and Wallace explained his objectives and hopes running for president. And here's what he said. Yanis, do you want to continue with these couple?
Yes, absolutely, with pleasure. We know that our candidates will not be elected. You see, this party, like all others, built around the principle and still unsuccessful in interesting a majority of the people, can have no hope of election. But it is necessary for us to set up our own candidates as a rallying point, for one thing, and because we can get no recognition from many of the other nominees.
So there's your way. You may not get invited to the debates, but just by running, just by being a candidate, some level of recognition has to be offered. And he continues.
In 1912, we took our first part in an election. We were not on the regular ballot, but a few hundreds in New York wrote my name on the vote for president. In 1916, we took no active part in the campaign. Things died down for a while. The next year, it was revived, and we were entered officially on the ballots in 16 states in the 1920 campaign. This year, we will be entered in about 35 states.
Sounds promising. Sounds like they're making progress. That, and their challenge is a little bit of success, and you start to feel like eventually, if we keep pushing at it, something will happen. Well, okay, what happens? The votes are counted in November 1924. The winner is Calvin Coolidge. He had taken over as president upon the untimely death of Warren Harding in 1923, and he comes out victorious. The Democratic Party candidate, John Davis, comes in second, and Robert La Follette, the progressive candidate, finishes third. So a third party did, get some level of support, but unfortunately, the Commonwealth Land Party was not able to shake the electoral tree, and get much recognition. But they didn't give up. They felt like they learned some lessons. So the candidates were listed on only a few state ballots, unfortunately. So they had activity in, as they said, 35 states, but they didn't end up on the ballots. In New Jersey, the ticket received only 219 votes. In Illinois, they received 421 votes, and in Pennsylvania, just 296 votes. And they were not even on the ballot in New York or California. And that's really remarkable when you think about it, because New York and California were the hotbeds of the single tax supporters. California, you remember, had the Great Adventure, where they attempted to get the single tax adopted by initiative and referendum. And there, several different efforts it started out with almost 500,000 people signing the petition in the first year, and it came down a little, and it came down a little, and a little bit more as each passing year. But not to even get on the ballot in California, it was pretty surprising to me, given the amount of effort that had been put out to try to get there. Well, despite the demoralizing outcome, the party leaders were determined to continue and try to make the Commonwealth Party grow on single tax principles. So during 1925, the party ran a lot of candidates in state and local elections across the country. A physician named Mark Millikan, active in Ohio, wrote this in the September-October issue of the Single Tax Journal, or Land, I guess it was Land and Freedom. Okay. Anyone else care to step up and volunteer to take over from Giannis?
Yes, I will.
Thank you, Wynn.
The stand
I see Wayne's hand up. Wayne, you'll be next. Go ahead, Wynn.
The stand patters will be getting out literature and make many converts to their plans because they are organized. As there is no election this year where single taxes could run with any good reason, we might all make our contributions toward propaganda.
So that's where they thought they could now step up, get literature out, get people, receiving information about the Commonwealth Land Party and the fact that it's still alive. In 1926, they sent a delegation to the International Single Tax Conference in Copenhagen, Denmark. And that was hosted by the Henry George Association of Denmark. So there's a photograph of those who attended, who came all the way from all across the world, to join together to fight for the single tax. 1926 was another important year for this reason. This was the year single taxers all around the world came together to found the International Union for Land Value Taxation and Free Trade. Charles O'Connor Hennessy of New York was elected president. Opening the international conference, he spoke about the global political challenges of the time. And here he goes. Wynn, you want to continue, please?
Sure. We must be more than idealists. We must be practical reformers. For us, the power to retard as well as to advance social justice is also with the masses of men in every land. We who would lead the way to economic emancipation may not travel any farther or faster than the minds of men will go with us.
Yeah. How are you going to change the minds of people? Well, education is certainly one of the ways. Propaganda is propaganda education. If the propaganda is truthful, it certainly can be educational. And so they were committed to trying and reach as many people as possible. And of course, the main organ of the movement at the time was Land and Freedom. Again, this was formally called the Single Tax Review. And just as they changed the party to the Commonwealth Land Party, they changed the name of the publication to Land and Freedom, hoping to really attract people to the idea that there's this connection between land and freedom. And what is that connection? Well, you have to read the magazine in order to find out. But Land and Freedom is the main publication reporting on the Commonwealth Land Party. And in its pages, it highlighted what was a diminishing level of action around the country during 1927. Optimistically, monthly meetings were being held in New York City and in some other cities. And this was reported in the January-February 1927 issue of Land and Freedom. They wrote this. Go ahead, Wynn.
Several of the members have filled speaking assignments. George Lloyd has personally distributed many thousand single tax tracts, including the platform of the Commonwealth Land Party.
Yeah. One person distributed many thousand single tax tracts. I don't know. Did he got on the street corner and hand them out? Maybe that's what he did. Michael would tell us that some of the single taxers and the Georgists in London would go into what's the center of London where all the public speaking takes place, Michael? Piccadilly Circus?
Yeah, it's Hyde Park Corner.
Hyde Park.
Yeah. It's Hyde Park Corner, the little space. It's still there, but I don't think it's very active there.
So people who want to hand out literature or speak their mind, they have to use another avenue.
Yeah.
Well, this was the avenue that they've been using. Henry George's printing company turned out thousands of copies of tracts back in the late 1880s. So this was familiar ground for many people.
And all you have to do is convince people to take a stack of them and get out there and try to distribute them in any way you can.
Yeah, they charged for them, but they got a lot of them out there, and it was material that was taken from the standard, and line for line, it was all identical. So whatever stick of type there was, it was rearranged in the column to fit the tract. And it had multiple kinds of material in there, usually some poetry, or here's a thing to the tune of march, other hymns or songs that people knew.
Well, it had to be quite an operation in order to produce that quantity of material, and rather expensive too. I imagine that up at least until the Joseph Fels Fund was redirected toward Zionism by his widow, that a good deal of money was used to achieve that purpose from the Fels Fund.
You had the name Geller, and I've forgotten the first name, but he also went on to produce a lot of tracts. He or his son, I'm not sure which one.
Well, in 1927, as the year advanced, there was evidence in Land and Freedom that the commitment to maintaining an independent political party was now being replaced by a return to educating both public officials and the general public. And this was evident at the Henry George Congress of the Henry George Foundation that was held in New York City in September. Land and Freedom reprinted the address by Edward Pollock, P-O-L-A-K, who described the movement's biggest challenge. He said this.
One of the more important things for us to discuss at this convention is how to bring in the young people. The old gray heads are passing away. Who will be left to carry on the work when we are gone?
And I think just about every 30 years, the surviving members of the Georges community have said much the same thing. I remember when I went to my first Henry George school conference, and it was in New York. And I walked into the room still with blonde hair, and I was in my late 20s, and people who were there immediately, acknowledged me and recognized me because I was one of the few people who did not have gray hair in that room. It was rather interesting. Okay, go ahead, Wynn, there's more.
What are we doing to interest the young? How many are we enrolling in our cause each year? We have not attracted the young folks because we have neglected the social side of life. Ours is an intellectual movement and as such has not appealed to the young, except in a few cases.
And finally,
if we are to attract them to our movement, we should follow the methods used by other organizations that successfully attract them, namely the churches, colleges, universities, political clubs, etc. After they are brought into the fold of our social life, they can then be put to work to do the real work of organization.
So, reactions to that. What do you think that the current generation of followers of Henry George should be doing? Is this kind of organization feasible? We do a little bit of that, but
absolutely. But it's true that that the main George's institutions, they mainly stay kind of on the intellectual side at best, and even in that case, they're kind of like introverts. I mean, both the Schreckelbach and the Henry George School, they have large endowments compared to other think tanks. And you see other think tanks, they organize conferences. They do like they create like noise around their whatever agenda is, but we seem to be a little bit introverts on our side. And I think a worrisome trend that I've observed is that our institutions are used by outsiders or foreigners to the Georgist cause, okay, as resume building places. Oh, I was on the board of the Henry George School. They don't care about Henry George. Most of them, they haven't even read Henry George. They vaguely know, oh, it's about land or anything, but then what I'm trying to say is that they won't put their heart and soul into promoting the mandate that these institutions have very clearly articulated in their charters. So any good activity that's coming out from our institutions doesn't help George. It helps other causes, but not George.
This is a touchy subject. It has it requires a lot of discussion, and the unfortunate situation we're in is that the Council of Georgist Organizations is now dissolved, and so the prospect,
really?
yes, and not enough interest in coming to annual conferences, traveling, the expense, and all that. I mean, when I first got involved with the Georges community, these conferences were very well attended. I mean, comparatively well attended. Several hundred people would show up, and you got a chance to meet the people who had been very much involved, have a lot of discussion, as well as get to know them as people. And so
Yeah.
if you want to talk about an extroverted experience, those conferences were in that sense. Now, there's one point that has to be made. Many efforts were made by people to bring local people in and invite them in to get them interested. And that was always very difficult. And it only became theoretically possible with the formation of Common Ground USA and chapters in local communities with members. And then, if Common Ground may still expand and take on that role, I don't know if it will or not, but at least Common Ground is reaching out, and there are new young members joining the Common Ground chapters, and particularly on the West Coast, very active people. And the positive thing about that is there are people that I don't know. That's what makes me optimistic. The fact that there are now people in the Georges community that I've never met, and I don't know them. Sue Walton. Sue,
right. Just to clarify a couple of things. One, we are in the process of dissolving. We are not officially dissolved as a council, but the vote is in the process for Pennsylvania law to the council.
okay, I
we're
stand corrected, and I'm sorry I jumped the gun, Sue.
No, don't worry. A majority of our people members have voted for this, and our assets have been taken over by Common Ground USA. To clarify a couple of things, even the youngsters that are in Common Ground, we had a surge of membership last year. But when we came to trying to renew these people this year, the youngsters have gotten rather upset with their brethren as to why aren't you staying around? One gentleman said, "Hey, I'm in law school, I can't do it." And several people actually apologized. So we'll see them when they have time. But unlike when we were growing up, we didn't have as many external activities like baseball, softball, band. Everything's competitive. So when they get married and have kids, the kids come first because they've got to go all over the place. So that this will be a slow growth for us. Luckily, as you say, there are definitely some youngsters out there that even I don't know, and it's really funky to say, "Hey, I can refer you to such and such a person," and hopefully that they get the connection. And Common Ground is the definite place to go when we will see people and the like in terms of what. And it is the intention of others to possibly have a conference. Last year, we tried to have a conference, but only 2 people out of the 18 speakers were willing to come in person to that CGO conference.
Yeah, we are getting a little bit comfortable with this remote experience with
they totally got it, and so there is hope in there. It's just this is the year that we are transitioning, and there is talk among several other smaller Georges organizations to have a conference, but I don't know exactly when. It will probably be very low key because of the amount of hotel rates.
It may be low key, Sue, but everyone will be informed and invited.
Right? Oh, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks to you and everything. And Yazis, I really appreciate your thoughts and everything. It makes me feel good. So that's it. Thank you.
Bruce.
Okay, I just wanted to mention, again, from a family perspective, after the years in the Socialist Party, my father gave that up and went to work in the labor movement. And he did that for the rest of his life. And that labor movement involved, it was, well, basically he worked for the UIU, which was the Upholsterers International Union. And, they organized all the way across America.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the challenge with, you know, what Yana said is absolutely right. We're an intellectual community. And when we get together, we want to share our intellectual insights with one another, sometimes challenging each other to try to think more clearly than we maybe, have done in the past, and to be able to express ourselves more clearly. Well, there needs to be, I'm certainly, this sentiment that was expressed in 1927 is absolutely correct. They were working at the time with a much, much larger potential following. We're talking about, hundreds of thousands of people who had read Henry George's books, who had been, associated with single taxers, and the process of attrition was just beginning at that point. And it took a long time for, you saw the photograph of the international conference in Denmark, attracting people from all around the world. There were active international conferences up until the early 2000s. And then again, the same process of attrition occurred. Fewer and fewer people available to come to the conferences. The cost of getting there, much more expensive. People's time, taking time out of their lives in order to travel, long distance to an international conference because of their, work and family obligations, etc. So I don't know what to say about the difference of the world at the time, but certainly the law of large numbers was much more at work for the Commonwealth Land Party members in 1927 than it has been, in the subsequent decades. Marty, you wanted to add a comment?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about a different approach that hasn't been taken since the beginning, and that's becoming vocal, like, I don't know, like Code Pink and some others, where they interrupt these so-called experts and State Department people, and just point out where they're wrong. And I'm thinking that might be a tactic that would energize young people.
Well, are you suggesting that we're too polite?
Yeah.
Bruce, did you something else you wanted to say?
Just want to mention, in addition to working in the labor movement and the upholsterers union, my father was also involved in an organization called the Council Against Communist Aggression. And it was pretty intense, and I thought it was pretty effective in the, in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, well, this is again a strategy that anyone who's active with the perspective of the George's principles as their basis for their intellectual development have to decide how to spend their time and energy. What is it that you think you can accomplish? What's your constituency? I've told my story a number of times, and it's was basically simple: being part of the financial service sector and involved in housing financing. Once I discovered Henry George, the light went on, and I immediately saw the connection between how property was being taxed and the distress in the communities in which I was working. And so when I went to work for Fannie Mae in 1984, one of I had two objectives. One was personal, and that was advancing my career. The other was that I would join an organization that was committed to expanding home ownership, and including expanding home ownership to lower and moderate income people. But I could not, of course, begin to write to my executive officers, the people above me, and say, guess what? I have the solutions to all the problems that you describe. I had to develop credibility first. And so it took me until the 1990s to get people above me to begin to recognize that the property tax system, the conventional property tax, was a serious problem. And as a result of that, they gave me carte blanche to go out and talk to stakeholder groups all around the northeastern part of the United States. And I did a presentation to groups of bankers, to council members, community activists, et cetera, nonprofit people, on the virtues of land value taxation and how that could help expand the supply of affordable housing. Now, here's the one part of the moral of the story that education bears witness to. One of the places that I went to was Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where my company had what we called a partnership office, which was a local office dealing with local Pittsburgh, issues. And so we brought all these stakeholders together into a conference room. I gave a presentation. Josh Vincent accompanied me on that presentation to help me. And not one of the people that was in that room listening to us was aware that Pittsburgh had ever had land value taxation or had a 2-rate property tax. They just didn't know. And that just demonstrated to me how important public awareness is, because even if you get the legislation passed, the next time there's an election, if the people who passed that legislation are not in office and you have new people in office, it can be repealed. And that's why public education is so important, and why we, those of us who are involved in education through the Henry George School and elsewhere, really have a challenge ahead of us and need to commit our energy and resources to expanding the public education. And that may be by joining organizations that we have another interest in and slowly building credibility so that they might listen to our perspective when we start talking about the perspectives that we have gained from Henry George. Giannis?
Yeah, on an optimistic note, I have to say that the optimistic part about Georgism is that the ideas of Henry George are really so powerful and so classic that regardless of, let's say, our, prowess and, success in promoting them, like, even if we fail, even if, let's say, the previous generation fails, like his words are classic. So you can see them, like, as more and more people realize that all their solutions, do they call it socialism? Do they call it unions? Do they call it, the labor movement? Do they call it capitalism, markets, whatever they call it, and they see it fails, they all go back to the message of Henry George. Of course, that doesn't mean that by itself is gonna spark, a flash in everybody's mind, but we should never despair. That's my point.
Yes.
Like in 2008, for example, I remember that's around that time. That's when I found by complete serendipity about Henry George. And I remember everybody was saying, now it's the time that everybody saw the importance of land and property. And indeed, the 2008 crisis was primarily on the ideas of Henry George. And then we didn't succeed in making that point across, right? However, you see, now we are almost like 15 years later, and I think now the message of George is even stronger. So the opportunity is even more fertile. So that's
well, I have an agreement with you, and I think the time for public receptivity to what we have to say is probably stronger than it's been in a very, very long time. And so we have to use those opportunities. And
Right.
and
Right. So in 2008, using quantitative easing and monetary expansion, they managed to sweep the problem under the rug.
of course,
But now we are in even more fortunate situation because these monetary expansion solutions, they have been discredited to a large extent.
And isn't a sad commentary on human nature and our political system that only when we're at the edge of crisis can sound thinking eventually come through? Douglas.
Yes. I think the way to get young people and people involved in all this is don't tie it to Henry George, tie it to climate change and global warming and things that people are interested in now. If you bring up Henry George and taxes, it's boring and confusing. People nowadays, at least the people I know, are worried about the climate. What's going to happen to the world? What's happening to the ecology? And so I suggest that you tie it in somehow with James Hansen's carbon tax and fee or citizens dividend.
Douglas, I only have one quibble, and that is you said you, and it's really us. We must, each of us in our own way, with our own constituency, whatever that constituency is. There are some people who will listen to us, and we have to find a way to get those people we think will listen to us to understand that it's in their best interest to pay attention and help us. And whether or not, if you're involved with a climate change activist group, that's a place to go. I belong to a sustainability organization in my local community, and I don't always talk about the same things. And I have talked about Henry George as someone who has influenced me and recommended his books, but I've also talked about the issues affecting climate change distinct from what Henry George would say. And we all have to do that if we're going to have, what is it? The ripple effect. We don't know what the ripple effect is, but each of us acting individually and separately and sometimes collectively can have a major impact. And I think Giannis is absolutely right. Now the time has never been more ripe for change than now, because we're in such a distressed situation and all of the standard solutions have failed. Joe.
Okay, I agree.
Douglas, go ahead. You can respond to me.
It's just the people I know, when I talk about taxes, they yawn and roll their eyes and change the subject. But they are interested in global change and what's going to happen to the climate.
So that's exactly what you should talk about, and find a way to frame your conversation without mentioning taxation.
Yeah, if you James Hansen mentioned or talks about a carbon fee and citizens dividend. A fee is much more understandable or presentable than tax. And a dividend where everybody gets a check in the mail is much more appealing than just talking about taxes and economics. But I don't know how to do this. But
well, you're doing a good job right now. So,
okay.
Again,
I suggest that we think about the carbon tax, carbon fee and citizens dividend, and recognize that land value tax is the same thing as a carbon fee, and or land value tax plus universal income.
Those
is-
issues are on the agenda and are being discussed all the time by many of the people that aren't here with us today. So
Okay.
you should feel optimistic that people have taken that advice to heart, and they're trying to tackle the problems as the general public understands them and give them a perspective that they haven't been considered up to that point. Joe
Okay.
Polito.
I
We're almost out of time, Joe. So
really enjoyed this. Just two quick points. One, I put in the chat several articles from our local newspaper. When I say local, it's near the largest in Canada. They're desperate about affordable housing, and all of those articles relate to that. And they mention Henry George. They mention land value taxes. I also added to that the Financial Times link to Martin Wolf, who is in support of that. So these issues are available. The other one is that I agree with Douglas, and in Canada we do have a carbon tax, and there is a refund to the citizens. In most cases, they actually get back more money than we're spending. Not all, obviously, some people are much bigger users of carbon, but that is the way it is being used that way, and it seems to be getting a good reception here.
Thanks, Joe. Giannis, did you have a final comment before we close out today?
Yes, to Douglas's point on climate change, if it didn't pay to pollute, people wouldn't pollute. They wouldn't produce fossil fuels if they were not getting immense rents. So tax the rents away, or force them to give it back, and then their production or their incentive to produce and use polluting fossil fuels would diminish. So simple.
And so we have plenty of economic literature written by a long list of economists and other policy analysts who have recommended to the political leadership exactly what Giannis has just said. And a lot of that very well-written, thoughtful analysis, footnoted, cited, etc., ends up in journals that never gets a public airing. And that's part of the challenge that we have. Marty Rowland is writing an article right now that will be hopefully published in the American Journal of Economics and Sociology. How many people will read that? We don't know. How many people are reading The Nation? How many people are reading The New Yorker? How many people are reading The Economist? And what are they getting out of all that? So who knows what is going to be the tool that's going to work. Many tools have to be tried at the same time. I leave you for this week with this slide, which shows a group of adults listening to a speaker on some subject, and it just is indicative of what the Georgists were thinking of in the 1920s as the elections had gone by. The Henry George Foundation developed a project that was called a lecture bureau, and they recruited speakers to go all around the country, in every city to talk to groups like this. Some speakers focused on teaching Henry George's political economy. Others sought to generate support for the single tax, and still others talked about the two-rate form of property taxation, and others talked about land nationalization, and others talked about how to minimize government by making it possible that some services would be privately provided, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all these things are going on, and it's 1927, and that's where we will pick up the story next week. So I see Wynn would like to make the last comment.
The idea of a lecture bureau has much earlier roots. when Henry George's 1887 campaign, not to be confused with the 1886 mayoral campaign, but this was for all of New York State, and I think he was running for Secretary of State.
Secretary of State, right?
There was a group of probably 10 or 12, maybe 15 lecturers who went city to city, town to town. One of them happened to be a Reverend Lincoln from Painesville, Ohio, who was the father of John C. Lincoln.
Oh, my.
And then in the teens, Frederick H. Monroe started a lecture bureau based in Chicago. And his son, John Monroe, was later very active in the Henry George School in Chicago.
And John Monroe will be mentioned a couple of times next week in our discussion.
As a seventh grader, I met him once, and I still remember it. He was
thanks for that, Win. And so thank you all for joining me, and we'll pick up the story next week. Much appreciated everyone's comments, and go out and do some good propaganda work. Good night to all.
Good night. Thank you all very much. And,
Thanks, Ed.
just a little announcement. Tomorrow we'll be having an event on AI and how it would impact labor. So it's a panel of 3 speakers, and Ed is going to be one of them to take a stand on behalf of Henry George. So we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you.
Should be great. Looking forward to it myself.
Thanks.